If I would have to sum up from the top of my head 5 things that we as human beings take for granted in our daily lives, I would probably say modern medicine, the internet, toilet paper, Tom Hanks, and crosswalks. It's just really hard to imagine a world without any of those things. So how exactly did crosswalks came to be? Who designed them in the first place? When were they first used? And what have explosions and a Bond villain to do with it? Well, let's find out, shall we? Before we go all the way back in time to the first ever crosswalk, let's look into what a crosswalk actually is. There are numerous types all over the world. If the crosswalk consists of painted patterns on the road, we call it a marked crosswalk. Design can be different depending on the country and city that you're in, but in general the more common ones are the standard American variant, which comes with 2 solid or dashed lines on both sides. There's also a solid variant. Then there is also the ladder. And finally, we have the all-time classic, the zebra crossing. This last design got its name from the British, who for some reason like to give every type of pedestrian crossing the name of an animal. There is, for example, the pelican crossing, which comes from pelecon, or pedestrian light controlled crossing, which indicates the use of a sign or a light to signal pedestrians that they can cross safely. Then there's also the toucan crossing, which literally means two can cross, indicating both pedestrians and cyclists can cross here. And finally, it probably cannot become any more British than the Pegasus crossing, which is specifically designed for horse riders, complete even with a higher located button. Crosswalks designed for horses are actually a bit ironic, considering the fact that the first ones, like the granddaddy of all crosswalks, were actually designed to cross over the road where the horses would go. For this, we would have to go back in time much further than you were probably expecting, before cars and automobiles. Because the first evidence of a crosswalk actually appeared during the era of ancient Rome, with the city of Pompeii, due to circumstances, let's put it that way, providing a bunch of really well preserved examples that people can still walk on today. The streets of Pompeii are littered with big stone blocks for pedestrians to walk over to the other side without touching the main road, which, by the way, also served as a sewage system. Pompeii actually had a lot of crosswalks compared to other Roman cities just because it didn't have an underground sewage system, like those other cities. So the roads had to serve as a city's main sewage, carrying garbage, feces, bones from slaughtered animals and all other sorts of nasty stuff through the streets. The streams could easily pass through the space between the blocks of the crosswalk, just as the wheels of passing merchant carts would be able to fit through those gaps. The fall of the Roman Empire in the year 476 also led to the fall of crosswalk innovations, sadly. It would take all the way until the year 1868, when a British railway engineer called John P. Knight took a railway signal, made some small adjustments to it, and put it right on the corner of Bridge Street in the middle of London, as a way to manage the herds of pedestrians who on a daily basis had to cross the street littered with driving horse carriages. As seen on this police notice from the time, the articulating arms would signal to the carriages and horse riders when they would have to stop to let the pedestrians cross. It even came with a gas-powered light, which could turn green or red depending on its status. The signal had to be operated by a police officer, who had to pull a handle to manually switch between the different stands. The signal wasn't given a long life, however, because not even a year later, in January 1869, the gas used to illuminate the lights at the top leaked and caused an explosion, gravely injuring the police operator underneath. No new crosswalk designs were invented for another 100 years after the explosion in London. In the United States, during the early 20th century, when the amount of motorized vehicles on the road really started to ramp up, authorities began drawing lines on the intersections to indicate where the pedestrians should cross. Of course, everyone ignored them. After the First World War, even more cars came to the road, which coincided with a steep rise in traffic accidents involving pedestrians. In an effort to reduce those types of accidents, a new crosswalk made its entrance on the British streets. A black and white striped pole with a large amber ball on top, no lights this time, signaled where to cross as a pedestrian. Early iterations used metal studs embedded into the tarmac to mark the crosswalk. Later on, more advanced patterns were painted on the road, as shown on this illustration found on a flyer for orphan children from 1934. Even though they had great intentions, those early crossings were accepted with a lot of skepticism. A lot of pedestrians didn't take kindly with someone telling them where to cross and where not. This cartoon, for example, from 1934 shows a possible future iteration on the crosswalk design where the pedestrians are literally catapulted over the road one by one. Eventually, it would take a Second World War and a steadily rising number of pedestrian-related traffic accidents in order for pedestrian safety to regain the spotlight in the UK, with a certain gentleman named Dr. George Charlesworth at the forefront. Charlesworth was a young physicist who during World War II worked on the design of the Barnes-Wallis bouncing ball, which was eventually used to attack the Roudans. You can check out this great video from Real Engineering if you want to know more about this story. After the war, he became a traffic engineer, and in 1949 was appointed to lead a bunch of teams working on intersection design, traffic signals, and also pedestrian crossings. It was at this moment that Dr. Charlesworth and his team began designing a new crosswalk. They knew in order to make this design stick, they had to keep it simple. Simple to understand by the pedestrians and the drivers, and also simple and cost efficient to apply for the cities and governments. This is how they finally came up with the design of the now well-known zebra crossing. Dr. Charlesworth always said he wasn't the one who came up with the idea of the zebra design. It was a complete team effort, he always explained. This didn't stop people, however, from giving him the nickname Dr. Zebra, which made him sound a bit like a Bond villain, don't you think?
I could have had you killed in the swamp. And why didn't you? You damaged my organization. Unfortunately, I misjudged you. You are just a stupid policeman.
For Dr. Zebra, the real challenge had only just begun. Previous crosswalk designs had all failed in winning over the pedestrians, who honestly were still very skeptical about the government telling them where to cross and where not. This is probably where Charlesworth's strongest talent came into play. Patience. He started up this huge marketing campaign showing everyone what this new zebra crossing was all about. He personally went to organizations, city councils and just normal pedestrians on the street to explain the safety benefits of crossing at the zebra crossing. One by one, the cities in the UK were starting to adapt the new design and people started actually using them. Other countries began to see the success as well, together with the simplicity of the design, and they started to implement them on their streets and intersections, until the zebra crossing was all over the world. Our would-be Bond villain had finally reached world dominance with his new crosswalk design. Later on in the 60s, a new animal-branded design made its way to the British streets, called the Panda Crossing. But this iteration was never able to put up a real fight against the now iconic zebra crossing. It showed up on intersections all over the world, from China to Brazil, and made its way to pop culture and media. Nowadays, it's hard to imagine what would happen if all those markings would just one day disappear, and what the effect would be on pedestrian-related traffic accidents. We can only guess how many lives crosswalks have already saved. Looking back, it's actually quite curious how similar the design of the zebra crossing looks to the first crosswalks in Pompeii. But as Dr. Charlesworth showed us, sometimes it's not the aesthetics of a design that matters, but it's the patience and the perseverance in telling the story of your design that makes all of the difference between just a bunch of lines on the road and a life-saving invention. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.